we have Saber who's just joined us. And Saber, I know you are in the thick of things in Sharm right now, so thank you so much for joining us, stepping out of your meeting. So I'd like to offer you the floor straight away. And we are going to invite you, please, to reflect, of course, on the conclusions of the roundtable. I referred to it earlier. But let me please begin by introducing you. We're joined by the Honorable Saber H. Chowdhury, Member of Parliament for Bangladesh, where he is also an honorary president of the IPU and has sponsored in Bangladesh many groundbreaking pieces of legislation, is a former chairman of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And I could just go on because, Saber, there is no parliamentary forum. You are not preaching the gospel of risk governance and DRM and action on climate change. So over to you, please, for your contribution to our discussion.
Thank you, Malini, and also to all of the honored guests. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be with you. I hope the background noise is not going to be a distraction because we have just started the first LDC ministerial meeting for finance. And as you know, finance is one of the most contentious subjects. We are still talking about the 100 billion that was promised in 2009 and is yet to be delivered. And so I will actually be making the statement on behalf of the LDC ministers. So that's why I have to really stay in that session. But I'm very happy to be with all of you, and I've heard with interest the previous distinguished speakers. So let me just briefly talk about the roundtable that we organized. I think it was in the first week of October. And this was a roundtable that was organized jointly by the UNDRR, and it was very effectively supported by the Climate Vulnerable Forum Global Parliamentary Group. So we actually have a parliamentary dimension to the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is great for us, and also, of course, Malini Globe International. And this brought together parliamentarians from a number of countries. Of course, I'm from Bangladesh. But in addition, we had Canada, we had Ghana, which is now the new chair of the parliamentary group of the CBF. We had Mauritius, we had Mexico, Suriname, Trinidad, Tobago, and the UK. So you can see it was a really very good mix of countries. And so from small island states to developing states, we had them all. And this was particularly important, I think, for two reasons. One is that the Sendai Framework is the only framework of the three, the other being climate change, the Paris Accord, and the Sustainable Development Goals, where the parliamentarians specifically identified and mentioned in terms of the role that they have to play in implementation of Sendai. So obviously, any midterm review is going to be incomplete without the inputs of the parliamentarians. And next year is when we have the midterm review. I believe it is in May of 2023. And then, of course, there are also a lot of other important events happening, because we know that this particular agenda doesn't operate in isolation. It is very closely linked to the overall Sustainable Development Goals. And there is going to be the SDG Summit next year. The Secretary General of the UN has also called for a summit for the future, where risk, resilience, climate change, sustainable development will all come into play. And we also have the Paris Agreement stop date. And given the growing convergence of risk reduction and climate change in terms of action that is to be taken, so next year becomes a particularly important year. So the roundtable gave us all an opportunity to share from our perspectives what we have done with this great, and I would use the term privilege, because parliamentarians have been entrusted with this special responsibility. And so what have we done with it? What have we learned over the past 7 years? And how can things be done better? So this was really the scope of the discussions. And it was very interactive. There were no prepared speeches, so parliamentarians spoke very freely and candidly. Of course, there were also some critical observations in terms of how we can do things better. And I think that was the whole point of having a midterm review, so that if there are course corrections needed, we can address them. If something has to be tweaked, we look at that. What has worked well, what could work better. So basically quite a critical analysis. So of course for us, legislation is very important. So one is we talked about the legislation that has been enacted in the region. We have also talked about the need to establish accountable institutions, which I think is absolutely critical. And most importantly, how do we understand risk? I think we came back to this point again and again. It's a very small word, only 4 letters, but enormous implications. And unless we understand risk, we are not really able to mitigate it. We are not able to respond to it. And then what sort of governance we have in place to address that issue is also not there. So this was a very important part of our overall discussions. And then from risk, we go to risk governance. How can risk be then used in terms of looking at governance and other things through the lens of risk? So risk governance came up time and again. And how do we understand it? How do we allocate funds for it? Because it all flows from that one very basic understanding. We also felt that there was a need to have a roadmap and also, identify the financial sectors. How are the financial sectors going to be brought into the loop? There was discussion about the importance of the Ministry of Finance. How can the Finance Ministry be sensitized to this whole agenda? The importance of risk and how investment pays off. We had a long discussion on that. There was also a lot of demand, and I use that term deliberately, for capacity building. Capacity building of individual parliamentarians, capacity building of the institution of parliaments, so that, in a democracy, of course, we know that representatives come and go. But where is the institutional knowledge going to be stored so that future parliamentarians and representatives can learn from that knowledge? So there was also that. And then also in terms of parliamentary procedures and the committee system, can that be aligned towards this whole concept of risk? And we know that there are two types of committees. In the UK, for instance, you also have thematic committees, whereas in countries like Bangladesh, you have individual ministerial committees, which have a much more narrow focus. So they look at the work of the ministry rather than the overall team. We also looked at what are the areas where we can tighten existing legislation. So one scenario is that we have legislation, but it needs to be tightened. In a study with the GLOBE was also involved, along with the CBI parliamentary group, where we were looking at gaps in legislation. Where are the gaps that exist? So one is tweaking, strengthening existing legislation, and other to see where there are actually gaps in legislation. And close. Because the whole issue of renewables came up very strongly. Fossil fuels, which is causing the emissions. What can be done about that? What sort of actions we can take? Setting of favorable tariffs, encouraging investment in renewables. That all came up, and then also trying to see whether corporations, not just governments, because corporations are also responsible for a lot of these unsustainable actions and emissions, how they can be brought into the fold of things. The importance of data which is disaggregated, which is timely. We don't want to be looking at data with.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. We don't know if we're going to be able to get Saber back. He just dropped off. We'll just see if we can. But I think he was nearing the end of his remarks. A shame, because I would have wanted to have the opportunity to thank him. That was quite masterful. Our roundtable was several weeks ago, almost a month ago now, and he's just remembered some of the highlights. Oh, he's back. He's back.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah,
He just dropped
yeah.
off.
No, something happened here. Obviously, the chair didn't like me speaking on the platform. No, so I was actually saying, I was talking about the need for natural capital, the need to evaluate, the need to measure it, which is so very important. And I, in fact, shared one of my own insights. I was recently in an event where they were talking about, if you lose your natural capital, it is going to impact upon the sovereign ratings of countries. And that in turn is going to impact negatively your ability to access finance. So, I mean, natural capital, not just for nature-based resources in terms of adaptation, in terms of building resilience, but also as an overall objective, given that your country's sovereign ratings are related to it. That was it, Malini, just a brief summary and a recap.
Yeah, I was just saying, when I thought that we'd lost you and I didn't have a chance to thank you while you were still with us, that was a masterful recap of a roundtable that was held almost 3 to 4 weeks ago. So thank you so much, Saber. Your powers of recall are phenomenal. But also the many other points that you have raised, I mean, not least your last one about the linkage between natural capital and the credit rating and credit worthiness of countries. So I know that you probably have to return to the LDC ministerial, but we're very grateful for those very important words of encouragement and expertise. So we hope we will catch up with you in person in
Absolutely,
Sharm very
absolutely.
soon. But for now, I'd like to thank you for your contributions.